Imagine you are standing in a dimly lit nursery, the air heavy with the scent of lavender and old wood. You are holding a newborn, feeling the rhythmic, shallow breath of a life that didn't exist 9 months ago. You look down at the tiny, wrinkled face, searching for a trace of yourself. You see the curve of your own chin, the specific arch of an eyebrow, and in that moment, a deep, primal sense of recognition washes over you. You are certain this child is yours. You feel a biological pull that seems as ancient as the stars. But here is the problem. That feeling of certainty is a modern luxury, a psychological trick designed to keep you from noticing a terrifying reality. For 99% of human history, that moment of recognition was a complete and utter guess. For 300,000 years, every man who ever looked at his child and felt, mine, was operating in a state of total biological blindness. This wasn't just a minor inconvenience for our ancestors. It was a fundamental glitch in the human operating system that shaped every law, every religion, and every social hierarchy we have ever built. We like to think we have always known where we come from, but for the vast majority of our time on this planet, paternity was the world's most successful long-term mystery. That biological link seems like an unshakable truth, something written into the very fabric of our being. But for the vast majority of human history, biology was actually the least important factor in being a father. We have been raised on the myth that dads have always known, but the reality is that the concept of a biological father is a relatively recent invention. For most of our prehistory, humans didn't even have a clear understanding of the mechanical link between the act of sex and the birth of a child 9 months later. Think about the lag time. In a world without calendars, clocks, or written records, connecting a single night of intimacy to a crying infant nearly a year later is not a natural logical leap. It requires a level of abstract tracking that early humans likely didn't prioritize. To them, pregnancy was a mysterious ripening, something that happened to women, often attributed to spirits, the moon, or specific foods. The idea that a man's invisible microscopic contribution was the cause would have sounded like science fiction. This lack of knowledge created a massive power vacuum in the human family structure. While a mother's connection to her child was undeniable, she was there for the birth, the nursing, and the grueling months of gestation. The father's role was essentially a ghost story. He was there, then he wasn't, and then suddenly there was a new mouth to feed. It sounds like a desperate situation to be a male in a species with such an invisible role. But rather than despair, humans developed a way to see what wasn't there, and they did it through the clever use of social engineering. Because biology was a black box, ancient humans relied on the most deceptive tool in the human arsenal, the human eye. This brings us to the fascinating and slightly manipulative world of paternal resemblance. In 1982, researchers Martin Daly and Margot Wilson conducted a landmark study that revealed a bizarre quirk in how we talk about babies. They recorded 111 births and analyzed the very first things family members said when they saw the newborn. They found that the mother's relatives were significantly more likely to claim the baby looked just like the father than the mother. Statistically, a baby is no more likely to look like its father than its mother, yet the social pressure to affirm that resemblance is overwhelming. Daly and Wilson argued that this is an evolved social tactic. By constantly telling a man that the baby has his nose or his eyes, the community is effectively tricking him into staying. It's a survival mechanism for the infant. If a man believes the child is his mirror image, he is far more likely to provide protection and calories. We see this even today. Have you ever noticed how people at a baby shower will practically trip over themselves to find a likeness between a father and a child who looks like a generic potato? That's not just politeness, it's a 300,000-year-old insurance policy. Seeing is believing, and for most dads throughout history, that visual confirmation was enough to keep the peace. But for others, the eyes were too easily fooled to be trusted, so they turned to the soul instead. If you traveled to the Trobriand Islands in the early 20th century with the famous anthropologist Bronislaw Malinowski, you would have found a culture that completely rejected the idea of biological paternity. The Trobrianders believed that children were created when an ancestral spirit, known as a baloma, entered a woman's body. To them, sex was just something people did for pleasure, It had nothing to do with making babies. When Malinowski tried to explain the Western concept of fatherhood as a biological link, the locals thought he was being ridiculous. They pointed out that many women had sex but didn't get pregnant, and some women who were less active did. To them, the father was simply the man who was married to the mother. He was the guardian of the child, the one who helped raise it, but he had no physical connection to it. This spirit child model sounds like a myth, but it solved a massive social problem. By removing the biological requirement, they removed the anxiety of uncertainty. If no man is the true father, then every man who steps up is the right father. It turned paternity from a blood debt into a social contract. It was a world where you didn't have to worry if the baby was yours, because the very question didn't make sense. Spirituality seems like a messy way to run a society, relying on ghosts to explain why babies appear. But in the rainforests of South America, certain tribes found a way to make messy mathematically superior through a concept called partible paternity. The Ache people of Paraguay and the Bari of Venezuela traditionally believed that a child could have multiple biological fathers. Their logic was that a fetus is built slowly over time, and it takes the contributions of multiple men to fully form a human being. A woman might name one man as the primary father and several others as secondary fathers. This sounds like a recipe for chaos, but anthropologist Stephen Beckerman found something shocking when he studied the Bari. Children who had multiple recognized fathers actually had much higher survival rates, up to 20% higher, than those with just one. Because instead of one man feeling a 50-50 chance of being the father and providing mediocre support, you had 3 or 4 men who all believed they were, partially, the father. This created a network of protectors. If the primary father was killed in a hunt, the secondary fathers stepped in without hesitation. They weren't just being nice, they were protecting what they believed was their literal physical investment. It was a brilliant evolutionary workaround. By sharing the uncertainty, they multiplied the child's chances of reaching adulthood. They turned the problem of multiple partners into a life-saving feature. These flexible systems sound peaceful, almost enlightened, as if our ancestors had found a way to bypass jealousy entirely. In reality, they were a luxury of the wanderer that the farmer couldn't afford. Everything changed about 10,000 years ago with the birth of agriculture. The moment humans stopped moving and started claiming land, paternity went from a social curiosity to a civilizational crisis. When you own a plot of dirt or a herd of goats, you need to know exactly who is going to get them when you die. You don't want to give your life's work to the neighbor's kid. This is the exact moment in history when the control of female sexuality became an obsession. If you look at the Code of Hammurabi, written around 1754 BC in ancient Mesopotamia, the laws regarding paternity are brutal. Law 129 states that if a married woman is caught with another man, they are both to be bound and thrown into the river. This wasn't about morality in the way we think of it today. It was a property law. An unfaithful wife was seen as a threat to the integrity of the inheritance line. She was a corrupter of the bloodline. By ensuring that a woman had no access to other men, the society could manufacture paternity certainty through isolation. The high walls of ancient cities and the restrictive veils of early civilizations weren't just cultural fashion, they were the first paternity tests. They didn't test the blood, they tested the perimeter. Strict laws and high walls create a sense of order, but they are incredibly fragile structures built on the hope that no one ever climbs the fence. For the Romans, the anxiety of paternity was so pervasive that they had to invent a legal stopgap to prevent the entire legal system from collapsing under the weight of doubt. They called it pater is estate quem nuptiae demonstrant, which translates to, the father is the one to whom the marriage points. In other words, if you are married to the mother, you are the father, period. The law didn't care about the biological truth, it cared about the social stability. A Roman father, or pater familias, had the power of life and death over his children, but that power was only granted once he physically picked the child up off the floor in a ceremony called the sublatio. By picking up the baby, he was making a public declaration, I accept this child as mine. It was a legal fiction designed to override biological uncertainty. Even the most powerful empire in history realized that if you allowed men to constantly question their paternity, no one would ever invest in the next generation. They chose the truth of the marriage contract over the truth of the bedroom. It was an admission that, for all their legions and laws, the Romans were still just guessing. The legal fictions of the Romans worked for a time, but they couldn't survive the arrival of modern science, which stripped away the comforting illusions we had spent millennia perfecting. For thousands of years, we lived in a world where the truth of paternity was whatever the village, the church, or the law said it was. But in 1984, a geneticist named Alec Jeffreys was working in a laboratory at the University of Leicester when he stumbled upon a technique called DNA fingerprinting. He realized that certain sequences of DNA were highly variable and unique to individuals, and that these markers were inherited directly from parents. For the first time in 300,000 years, the mystery was over. You didn't need to look at the baby's nose. You didn't need to throw anyone in a river. You just needed a cheek swab. This technology was first used in an immigration case to prove a boy was indeed his mother's son, but it quickly became the ultimate truth machine for fathers. However, when science finally turned its light on the human family, it found some very uncomfortable things. Modern studies on non-paternity rates, where the presumed father is not the biological father, often hover between 1 and 3% in general populations. In some specific high-risk groups, that number can climb much higher. While that percentage sounds small, think about the sheer volume of human history. It means that for thousands of years, millions of people have lived, died, fought wars, and inherited kingdoms based on a total misunderstanding of their own origins. It seems like we have finally reached the end of a journey where technology has replaced the guesswork of our ancestors with cold, hard data. But this new clarity has brought its own kind of chaos. In the past, the unknown allowed for a certain kind of social flexibility. A man could choose to be a father regardless of the biological reality, and the community would back him up. Today, the availability of home paternity tests has turned that social bond into a precarious thing that can be shattered by a $100 kit from a drugstore. We have traded the useful lie for the uncomfortable truth, and we are still figuring out if the trade was worth it. We see this tension in our legal systems today, where courts often still uphold the presumption of paternity for married men, even in the face of DNA evidence that says otherwise. Because the law knows what the ancient Romans knew, that a society built on biological absolute truth is much harder to maintain than one built on social commitment. We are the first generation of humans to ever truly know who our fathers are, and that knowledge is heavy. It changes how we view ourselves, our families, and our very history. All of this research into the history of paternity leads to a single, inescapable conclusion. We have spent the last 300,000 years building a massive, intricate fortress of culture, law, and religion, all designed to protect us from a simple biological fact that we couldn't verify. The pair bond, the concept of legitimacy, the very structure of the nuclear family, these aren't just natural outgrowths of human love. They are defensive structures. They are the tools we use to manage the anxiety of the unknown. When you look back at the Accae with their multiple fathers, or the Romans with their legal declarations, or the Trobrianders with their spirit children, you aren't just looking at weird customs. You are looking at different ways of solving the same impossible puzzle. We were always trying to find a way to make a man stay and care for a child that he couldn't be 100% sure was his. And the most successful solution wasn't science, it was storytelling. We told ourselves stories about resemblance, stories about spirits, and stories about the sanctity of marriage. We lived in those stories for hundreds of millennia, and they worked. They built the world we live in today. But those stories were always just a veil over the void. The sheer effort humanity has poured into identifying fathers, from the brutal drownings in the Euphrates to the radioactive probes in Alec Jeffreys' lab, shows just how much we fear the idea of an untethered life. We want to belong to a lineage. We want to be part of a chain that stretches back into the dark of prehistory. But that chain has always been made of paper, not iron. It was held together by the collective willpower of communities who decided that who raised you was more important than who made you. We have finally developed the technology to see through the paper, to see the actual iron links of biology underneath. And yet, even with the data in our hands, we still find ourselves looking at newborns and desperately searching for our own eyes in their faces. We are still playing the same game our ancestors played in the caves, because the truth of a DNA test is a cold, lonely thing compared to the warmth of a social bond. We are a species that was forged in the fires of uncertainty, and that uncertainty is what made us human. It forced us to create laws, to invent religions, and to learn how to trust one another when we had no reason to. The mystery of paternity was the friction that sparked the flame of civilization. If we hadn't had this problem, if humans worked like seahorses, where the male carries the young in a pouch for all to see, our entire history would be unrecognizable. There would be no dowries, no illegitimate children, no obsession with virginity, and perhaps no concept of private property as we know it. Our world is the specific shape it is because for a very long time, men didn't know something that women did. That asymmetry is the secret engine of human history. It created a world of jealousy and control, but also a world of deep social commitment and the invention of the family as a legal unit. We are the children of the unknown. We are the descendants of the men who decided to stay, not because they had proof, but because they had a story they believed in. Every time you see a father holding a child, you are seeing the continuation of that 300,000-year-old act of faith. It is the most successful gamble in the history of life on Earth. And even now, in the age of genetic certainty, we still feel the echoes of that ancient doubt every time we look into a mirror. That brings us back to the nursery, to the lavender-scented air and the quiet breath of the newborn. You are still looking at that face, still seeing the curve of the chin you think you recognize. You feel a sense of peace, a sense of belonging, and a sense of knowing. You might even have a printed report from a lab tucked away in a drawer that proves what you feel. You think the science has finally closed the loop, that the mystery is finally over, and that you are standing on solid ground. But as you look at that tiny person, you have to realize that your relationship with them is still based on the same thing it was for the very first humans. It is based on a choice. The DNA is just code. The fatherhood is the action. We spent 300,000 years trying to find the real father, only to realize that the real one was always the one who showed up. The hunt for biological paternity was a quest for a truth that didn't actually matter as much as we thought it did. We built a world on a guess, and that world is still standing. We are finally living in the light of the truth, but we are still haunted by the shadows of the cave. We are finally certain, but certainty has a way of making the world feel a little bit smaller. Think about the billions of men who came before you, who never had a test, never had a lab, and never had a guarantee. They lived their entire lives in the maybe, and yet they built the pyramids, they sailed the oceans, and they raised the children who would eventually become you. They didn't need the truth to be fathers, they just needed the role. There is something profoundly beautiful about that long, dark history of uncertainty. It means that human society is held together not by biological necessity, but by a massive, collective agreement to believe in one another. We chose to be fathers before we knew how to be biological parents. We chose the social contract before we understood the genetic one. And as we move forward into a future where we can edit genomes and trace lineages back to the first common ancestor, we should remember that our greatest strength was never our knowledge. Our greatest strength was our ability to build a home in the middle of a mystery. We are the architects of a reality that didn't exist until we decided to believe in it. The next time you hear someone say a baby looks just like his dad, don't just think of it as a compliment. Think of it as a ritual. Think of it as the sound of a 300,000-year-old machine still running, still trying to keep the family together, still trying to bridge the gap between the mother's certainty and the father's hope. We are still that same species, still playing the same game, still whispering the same useful lies into the ears of the men we need to stay. We have changed the tools, but we haven't changed the heart of the problem. We are still trying to identify the father, not because we need to know the biology, but because we need to know who is going to hold the child when the lights go out. That is the real history of paternity. It isn't a story of blood, it is a story of the things we do to make the blood irrelevant. We have finally unraveled the genetic code, but the code is the least interesting thing about us. If this journey through the history of the world's oldest mystery has changed how you look at the people around you, I'd love to hear your thoughts on it. Do you think the sudden arrival of biological certainty has made our families stronger, or has it taken away something essential about the act of faith that fatherhood used to be? It's a strange new world we are living in, and we are the first ones to have to navigate it with the lights turned on. If you enjoy these deep dives into the hidden architecture of human behavior and the weird ways our ancestors solved the problems of life, please consider subscribing so we can continue exploring these rabbit holes together. There is always another story hidden just beneath the surface of what we think we know. For now, though, just remember that the person you call father is a much more complex figure than a simple strand of DNA could ever explain. We are all the products of a long line of men who were brave enough to be certain when they had absolutely no reason to be. The man who raised you was a masterpiece of social fiction. Every family tree is a carefully maintained hallucination,